welcome back everyone to the Shock Absorber podcast. It is as always. I always say that as always. Always, lots of always in the intro. Welcome back to the Shock Absorber. It's lovely to have you along with us. And I have two lovely people dressed in black shirts joining me today.
Yeah.
Usually it's Tim and Stu, but today it is Tim. Hello,
It
Tim.
is. Hello, Joel.
How are you?
I'm very well, thank you.
Why do you sound like a AI bot? Hello, Joel.
Hello, Joel. I am glad to be here.
That's good.
I don't know.
And for the first time on the Shock Absorber, Lewis is joining us. Hello, Lewis.
Hello.
Thank you for coming on. Lewis, you are a Berea intern here at Soul Revival Church and also First year at Moore College student. But you've also done YouthWorks College prior to that.
Yeah, did 2 years there.
Where Tim, I believe, was your lecturer. Is that right?
For a couple of subjects.
In a couple of subjects, yeah.
Good times.
Yeah, so thank you for coming on. We always start with a cultural artifact, and we were like, oh, it's going to be one. And then I said, Lewis, talk about why you enjoy Japanese culture so much. So have at it.
Oh, wow.
Nice and broad.
It's really
Nice
super
and broad to
because you went
panic
you went
within
pretty
me.
recently, right?
January.
Yeah.
Yep.
And it was a good time?
It was pretty excellent.
Yeah. What was your favourite thing about going to Japan on that particular trip? Or the highlight?
I think I've read, not heaps, but I think like probably more than most people about Japan and stuff. And I went with two friends who have an interest in Japan, but probably only in as far as it's like, I like the things that come from Japan, like games or music or something like that. And so it was sort of fascinating watching some of their reactions to certain things, particularly them just trying to pick up on like cultural customs and stuff. And it was just pretty entertaining at times.
But you're like, oh, that's not right.
No, I mean, like I was still learning a lot too. Like you can only sort of read so much about something.
You've got to experience it.
Yeah, before you go there. Something I never got used to was the fact that you can't hand people money when you pay for things. You got to put it on a little tray.
Oh, yes, I do remember that.
And push them the tray.
I mean, I would think I was the only time I was in Japan was in 2002, but I do remember that. Yeah, it is an interesting thing to have to do, isn't it?
Yeah, I don't really understand what the connotation is. I think it's sort of seen as like, it's a bit crass, like a bit thug-like maybe if you just sort of like
money straight to
waving money around or something. But yeah, we obviously pretty loose, don't think too much about that sort of thing. So, yeah.
Did you, this sounds like a really culturally insensitive comment, but did you go and do teppanyaki?
No, actually, we did not do. I've done teppanyaki, but not in Japan. I'm trying to think of what the most interesting cuisine consumed there was, but we weren't very adventurous.
It wasn't a Boss coffee.
We had a lot of Boss coffee, actually.
So can you, for the listeners and watchers who don't know what Boss coffee is, which it probably includes me to a degree, what is a Boss coffee? I mean, it's becoming more popular, I feel.
It's kind of huge. I think Australia has a particularly big investment in like their coffee culture, so I guess it works. But yeah, Boss Coffee is effectively just a brand of coffee from Japan, canned iced coffee, or hot coffee actually over there because they have the heated vending machines.
Vending machines, yeah.
And that's it. It's really just coffee. I guess it has a sort of unique branding behind it, which makes it sort of a cultural thing.
Even just buying coffee in a can is kind of, I mean, it's novel. I don't, maybe there are, I can't think of any other brands. It's even iced coffees like.
They're typically in bottles, aren't they?
Yeah, bottles or cartons or poppers or like there's lots of.
There's a few brands now, I think, that are catching on, but yeah, it's still pretty uncommon. But yeah, I don't.
So it has that iconic look, like it's.
I guess so.
Like because it's the only one in that.
It does have cool branding, and it's a cool name, isn't it?
It is. It's fun. Yeah, it's a Boss. Yeah.
Yeah. You feel like a boss when you drink it.
There's actually a series of commercials they did. Do you know who Tommy Lee Jones is?
Yep.
He's like the old white dude
Two-Face
from
Batman Forever, man.
Is he?
Yeah.
Well, I know him from. I know him as the Men in Black guy.
Tommy Lee Jones, the actor. Yep. Okay.
Yeah, the actor.
Yeah.
You know the Men in Black.
I think of Tommy Lee, the drummer for. Motley Crue.
Motley Crue.
Yeah. And I used to get them mixed up all the time, so I apologise. Yeah, but Tommy, he was in. What's the one that he did with? Is it Mel Gibson's On the Run? No, Harrison Ford's On the Run.
Oh, The Fugitive.
The Fugitive. That's a good movie.
It is a good movie. I forgot that he's in it.
Yeah, he's the leader of the
I think you're right, actually.
cops.
Yeah,
I forgot about that. Yeah. I just know him as the Men in Black guy. But yeah,
he's in Men in Black.
They do a series of commercials, still ongoing, I think, of him where he plays an alien, trying to assimilate into life in Japan, and the episode the ad ends each time with him drinking a Boss coffee with someone, and it's they're very, very funny.
That's cool.
Yeah, he's like the Boss coffee guy in Japan now.
Okay.
Tommy Lee Jones, like this old American dude.
Actor.
Yeah,
yeah.
But they love him.
Wow, that's crazy. And what do you think is the enduring appeal of Japanese culture for you? Is it unique?
It's something I ask myself a lot, actually. Actually, it's you kind of. I've just done it for such a long time that I'm at the point now where I'm questioning it. It's like, why do I care? And yeah, frankly, there's something very other about it, which makes it like fascinating as an onlooker. But two, I think there is something about their cultural output, their art, which somehow has resonated for long enough that it still brings me back to it. So I don't know. It's probably too big of a question to elaborate on now, but
that's right. It's an extremely unique place to go, I think, isn't it? And when you think about it, like, it's reasonably small on the map too, but it has it has a lot of cultural significance because they're
massively.
I find Japanese culture, they hold on to it very, very tightly and ensure that things aren't changed about it too much. And I think I remember when I'm going there, it's like, I don't know if I want to live here, but this has been one of the coolest experiences. I went for the when the World Cup was on.
Oh, yeah.
So that was a little bit different. I was just traipsing around Japan, but I loved going. Well, I'm a big fan of, I think we've talked about this before, but a big fan of transport systems, and the transport system in Japan is very well organised and very well run. So like you go on the bullet train, but also just even on the subway.
Oh, it's mad.
And the like Shinjuku station, we stayed quite close to Shinjuku station, which is like probably the biggest subway station, or where a lot of the lines meet.
Yeah.
And it's all underground, but it's underground of like hundreds of buildings almost. Like it's so huge.
The trains there were insane. I was telling the story actually at Bible study the other night. We had 2 delays our entire trip there. One was when like a freak snowstorm occurred, which is like, what are you going to do?
Yeah.
The other one was like there was a death on the tracks and it delayed the train by less than 5 minutes.
Wow.
It's just like insane.
That is insane.
Yep.
Yeah.
That's crazy.
Just thinking about the outsized influence of their culture, and you guys know Japan better than I do, but I'm just thinking, I wonder if some of that comes from their confidence, their self-confidence of knowing who they are as a people, and whether that has some resonance with the way that we've talked about, raising young people to be confidently Christian, that you can, if you've got a self-confidence in who you are because you've got an identity, then it doesn't really matter what the outside world says. Oh, you should be like this, you should be like this. No, we're just going to be uniquely us. I wonder if that might have something to do with it as well.
I think it's a very good point. Because I did a uni degree. It was business and commerce with a major in sports management, but I had a chance to choose an elective, and I chose politics in post-war Japan.
Okay.
Not because I was that interested in Japan, but it was I went to University of Western Sydney, and that was the closest campus at Bankstown to where I lived. But then I ended up really enjoying it because it was just such an insight into such a completely different culture. But I think you're right, Tim. I think it was, that being confident in that particular culture meant they were happy to stick with the values they think they represented as their culture. So I think it's a good point.
I'm wondering, Lewis, you, as well as just broadly Japanese culture, you've done, probably again more reading than most people on the church and Christianity in Japan as well. You want to just share some of your insights about a little bit of the history of Christianity in Japan as far as you've researched, and also kind of where it is at the moment as well.
Okay. Well, when I was asked onto the shock absorber, I did not expect this. So, as far as I understand, it was introduced in 1800s from one of the earliest sort of Western nations Japan traded with was the Dutch.
Oh, yeah.
And through the Dutch became a Christian influence. And early on, I think maybe it was like late 1700s, early 1800s, they begun to sort of establish some towns and churches there and trading ports, and then slowly over time, like Portuguese missionaries turned up, a lot of European missionaries. And I don't know the exact details, nor will I go into them all, but effectively there was a decision on the part of the government to sever their ties with the church, because it was mostly the Catholic Church had a primary presence there, if not a sole presence there as well, as far as I understand it. And they sort of saw that as a threat to national security, because they saw it as like the people have their allegiance to a foreign nation, basically. And so heavy persecution sort of ensued, almost eradicating it really, until say pre-war, close to like late 1800s. Japan started to westernize quite rapidly, opening up to all the other countries, and Christianity sort of crept back in, but there was such a strong cultural dominance, particularly in the war, about sort of basically emperor worship, and about like the uniqueness of Japan and their divine calling, effectively, to win the war and blah blah blah. And now in post-war Japan, I think I don't know if I really understand what's happening at the church there.
Right.
It's astronomically small. It has remained less than like 2% basically of the population, which if you look at any developed country is, I'd say, unprecedented, frankly.
Well, you compare that with South Korea, and there's obviously there's significant cultural, historical differences.
Yep.
But South Korea is a place which has also rapidly modernized, but Christianity is enormous.
Yeah,
in South
China
Korea.
is growing too. Like
Yep.
it's and yeah, Japan is just rigid, unchanged almost. And I find that aspect fascinating, actually, just in itself. It's like, why is that? And I don't really understand. But I think it's definitely linked to their sort of historical religious foundations and their roots, and how that's influenced their culture and thinking. So I think it's a very unique culture and history and a unique mindset. And I just don't know if people have figured out the way to successfully church plant there yet, or if there even is a way to, at least in this current cultural climate, like maybe something has to change. I don't know. But it's an ongoing battle. Like I think it's, people are still figuring it out.
Well, already I'm glad that you came on the podcast. So I've just learned something that I didn't know about before then. Before we do get on to like talking about the other things that we're going to talk about, Lewis, I'm a big fan of your story, becoming a Christian, because if anyone wants to check it out, you're actually on 2 Chip Lunch podcasts that we do as our sister podcast. But Lewis, you kind of came to church and for a very long time before becoming a Christian, and then you went to Youthworks College, and now you're at Moore College pretty quickly after becoming a Christian. Why did you want to get into studying the Bible so soon after becoming a Christian?
Can I interject quickly?
Yes.
Just want to correct myself. Christians were in Japan in the 1500s. Persecution was in the 1700s-ish.
Okay.
Oh, no. Yeah. 17th century persecution begun.
Okay. You were close.
Close-ish.
By about 100 years. But
Yeah. So don't listen to me too much. Why did I want to study that? I, in high school, particularly, say adolescence, young adulthood, I'd say the more I reflect on it, the more I think it was really like can't think of it in any other ways apart from a calling. I don't use that word lightly. I find the language of like feeling called strange, but the questions about death and purpose, morality were pressing, crushing even, in a way that frankly, not many people I've ever met seem to experience. Most non-Christians I know, when I just sort of talk to them about my experiences and the things I thought about death and just etc. What is it all about? They just seem, frankly, like unfazed by it, which is just something I could not fathom. There was sort of no point where I was not deeply disturbed by what was happening in the world, or with the issues of death and pain and meaning and purpose. And so, I think constantly there was a constant wrestling and a searching leading up to the eventual gradual conversion. Wasn't very climatic. But I think in looking for something for so long, it was just kind of felt like the only path forward, frankly. I just wanted to launch into it and learn more about it.
Yeah, right.
That's sort of where I am now.
Yeah, that's cool.
Yeah.
Was he a good student, Tim?
Oh, always. Yeah.
Model, textbook.
Model textbook student all the time.
All right. Well, thank you, Lewis. It's really cool to have you on the podcast, and obviously you'll keep contributing. I'm not kicking you off right now. Good. But my question was to go to Tim now, because we had our planning day last weekend.
We did.
It's one of the times where we all get together as a church, and everyone from church is invited to come along and start thinking about what God has got planned for us as we partner with him as he's building his church through us. We talked about a lot of it in the previous podcast of like planning for the planning day. But Tim, you got up right at the beginning and did a really great, what do we call it? Is it a Bible talk or a Bible study? Or
Yeah, I don't know what it was actually flagged with. It was basically kind of a mini sermon.
Yeah, it was.
We want to, we're Christians, we're evangelicals. We want to ground everything we do as a church on God's word, and so therefore it's appropriate to start with God's word, not to just jump into our thoughts, our plans, but actually to orient ourselves through the scriptures to what God is calling us to be. And we are flawed and we are fallible, and we may not always get that right, but we're constantly striving to put ourselves under the authority of scripture and say, okay, what is it that God wants us to do? What is it that he is directing us? And so we looked at Romans 12, 1-8, and talking about having our minds transformed by Christ, not by the world. And then Paul naturally transitions from there into, okay, so what does this actually look like in practice? What does it mean to have your mind transformed? It is to live it out in the congregation and amongst the body. And so then the body metaphor was a really great opportunity to talk about both our theology, which is Jesus changes everything, because that's what Paul talks about for the first 11 chapters of Romans. And then he leads into the putting this into practice. And one of our strategies we talked about a couple of weeks ago is that we strive to have an all-age, all-stage community. And part of why we do that, there's lots of multifaceted reasons why we have chosen that as a strategy, but one of them is we actually believe that it's biblical, and that the body of Christ metaphor, that there's a diversity in the body of Christ, and that diversity is for the church's good. And so part of intentionally being all age, all stage and creating congregations which are structured around difference and diversity is actually for our common good. And so, so we got to experiment with that and think about that, and then we talk about practice as well.
Yeah. So just to clarify for people, we kind of call our why, how, and what as a church as theology, strategy, practice. And then after you'd done it, which I did, a number of people feedback to me that you did a fantastic job. I think it was, and I agree. I think it was really clear, but also having it so biblically grounded was really important. But then we moved on to kind of talking about, well, today is really about implementing ideas, but through the filter of that theology, strategy, practice. But the one thing that we did try and emphasize a lot was the strategy. And we've talked about this so many times on the podcast, so that how important the strategy is for what you're doing everywhere else. An example for us is we always want to be intergenerational as much as possible, but also we have a meal at every gathering. And so that's part of the strategy, but how that looks like in practice might be different. So on Friday, Saturday, and Sunday nights, we have dinner, but we have other gatherings where we will have breakfast instead. But we always make sure we have a meal. Excuse me. Lewis, can I ask you a question? Were you there? You were there for Tim's talk, weren't you?
On the planning day?
Yes.
Yes.
Sorry, just double checking. Was that helpful for you? Because you were obviously, not obviously, I had, the one thing I forgot to mention was you're also one of our youth leaders.
Mm-hmm.
But do you think that was helpful, what Tim talked about, and then how we kind of followed up and emphasizing that strategy? Did you find that interesting / helpful? Like, what were your reactions to that? Was it clarifying for you?
I must confess, in my memory of any talk, any sermon, is typically the feeling it leaves with me.
Okay.
So if you ask me, like, what was last week's sermon about, I'd be like, it was about Samuel. I can't remember.
This is like asking me if Lewis is a good student.
Yeah.
Give me a live on-air assessment of how Tim did with his sermon.
It was the best sermon I've ever heard. But I remember being pumped. I'm like, yeah, like this is what I think. Like on the day before, we were talking about like at the meeting before the planning day, we were talking about like what is soul revival and what does it mean, and the language we use. And I just remember thinking like, yeah, like that is us. And yeah, as someone who sort of was I think you emphasize from memory like the sort of relational aspect of our church and why that's really important.
Yep.
And just without even looking for it in books, it keeps coming up in Christian biographies and books that I read about the testimony of like Christian relationships with like non-Christians and how that influenced them, like the non-Christians, I mean. And that was huge, like for me, if not pivotal in my becoming a Christian. If I did not have
Me too.
a place to not only hear what Christians believe and think and to have my questions answered, but to see how they live as well, and the way they treat you and love you. Like I can't imagine going to a church where you just walk in for the service, leave. I don't think I would have become a Christian if I didn't have such an emphasis on relationships and community. Yeah.
And going back to the meals, that's one of the reasons why we do meals at every gathering, because it allows for that extended time to create those relationships. In terms of my reflections, I think we went into it as the planning day talking about implementing ideas. And I think as a staff team, I'm really thankful that we're all really aligned on that strategy. But what I ended up just observing during the day was that it was also, the planning day is also a continual effort to help other people that are not part of the staff team to be aligned with the strategy as well. And so I think throughout the day it became a little bit less about implementing ideas, but more about going, when we have ideas, this is what we're going to test them against. I don't know if that was your experience, Tim. Sorry, you're just having a bit of a yawn. I apologise for being boring. Hey, we keep everything real on this podcast. But was that something that did that become apparent to you as well, or it might have just been the groups that I was leading? But was that how you felt? You were kind of needing to remind people about our strategy?
I think, I'd probably do it intuitively almost, in that that's naturally how my brain is thinking. You're always pushing to the why, and whether it's here at church helping people see the why, or whether it is when I do consultancy for YouthWorks, helping them to at least see their own why, so that it can keep pushing back to that. But yeah, so I did find that helpful, and we did do that. The main space I think that I helped lead that discussion was there were two different conversations. We split up at one point in our service teams, which is our the different types of ministries. We talked about the 10 service teams. Again, you can go back 2 episodes and listen to us talk about those. But we got youth, young adults, children service teams together. And we talked about what have we achieved in the last 12 months, where are we right now, where are we going? And people were throwing out ideas. And what we did is we tested a number of those ideas through that structure, and particularly that why, it's the how piece, isn't it? The strategy is the how. And is this idea going to reflect an all age, all stage community? Is it going to add positively to that? Is it going to be kind of neutral, or is it actually going to undermine that in some ways, even though it might have some other benefits? If it's not going to structure the way we do church together, then we're going to lose some of our, I suppose, confidence in the way that we do ministry in a uniquely soul revival way. And like we said 2 weeks ago, it's not that because, we're evangelists for soul revival as the best way of doing church, but it's, you have to land somewhere, and the more convinced you are and aligned you are with your own convictions, then it's going to, shape what you do. And we are blessed to live amongst, we often use the phrase church amongst churches. We are one church. There's lots of other ways of doing church, and there's lots of other beautiful churches in our area who do wonderful, beautiful things, who will do things different to us, and that's okay. But our strategy, keep bringing back the ideas of, let's pitch this idea, great. Does it align theologically, and then does it align strategically with how we are uniquely doing ministry? Then and then what will it look like in practice. So yeah, I did find that. So with the service teams, and then we also split into gatherings. So I was part of the Sunday morning gathering team, and same thing. What are our strengths over the last 12 months? Where are our weaknesses? Where are we right now? Where can we grow?
Yeah, and it's interesting to use that language, undermine, and I think that's maybe a good way to say that it's not intentionally undermining, but there can be some ideas that perhaps get in the way of executing that strategy as well as we possibly could. And I think that's a good way to think about it rather than saying that's the wrong idea. Because obviously people are going to come up with ideas and they want to bring ideas to the table, and I think that's perfectly reasonable and perfectly logical, but it's an interesting way to say, well, actually that idea may undermine what we're doing as a church, which is what has helped us through God so far achieve what we've been able to achieve, and we're really blessed to be able to do that. But if we start allowing particular ideas to undermine those areas, we may see that not fall apart, but really not be as effective as that's what I hear you saying anyway. But I think it's cool. Lewis, I just want to pick up one more thing on the planning day. You said that like you were kind of excited and interested, but why do you think that was the case? Is it because you just felt like there's a direction moving forward?
So
when we talked about the strategy, and you said that it was great to hear about that, were you enthused by it, like that, to hear that was actually where we were heading?
I think it is exciting, because I think going to youth group now, there's like 60, 70 kids every week, and I'm like, oh, that's me. Like, that's where I was. Right. And like, they're going to grow up with the same church, because like the strategy's consistent and we're like sticking with it, you know what I mean? And I've seen it work in myself and in others, and I'm confident in it. And it's exciting to be like, oh, like we get to share it with them, and they get to live through church, going through the same thing. It's like, yes, that's why it's exciting. And seeing like, we had like a bunch of our youth actually there.
They did,
front row.
Yes, of the planning day.
And I was like, that's sick.
Yeah.
It's sick.
And it's a really good example. I think youth is on Friday, like most churches, but yourself and your story is an interesting product of the time that we invested in Friday night and the youth group and everything else for people your age and younger to grow up into our community. And as an example, my son, who's in year 4, has just started coming to Fuse, our year 5 and 6 group. At the end of year 4, we allow people to start coming into that. Well, sorry, we invite them to come in. We don't allow. Anyone can really come at any time to Sorrel if they want to. But he's now seeing youth on a Friday night. So Fuse finishes and we all have dinner together, and then he's seeing the gathering, and he's like, there is a pathway for me to grow up in this church. And I think that's, as a parent, now seeing that happen is a really exciting thing to see, because I'm now seeing, so he's having great discussions about being a Christian and what it means and about his faith and all those kind of things, which is fantastic. But then to have another influence on him at church to be teaching him that as well, and then seeing other people who are doing exactly the same thing. So he has it's not exactly like he has a future, but he can see that pathway from now, even though he's been going to the Soul Revival Kids on a Saturday night as well. But even from that, we have a pathway for them from year 4 all the way up until year 10 when they graduate and become part of the main gathering, and also for late night and things like that. It's just really exciting to see, and it is a result of that strategy. So, Tim, I might let you speak to that too, because I think you probably will speak to it a lot better than I thought. But those pathways, as our children's minister, or children's pastor, I should say, that's an important thing for us, is we see children as the church of now, not just tomorrow. And we've invested a lot of time in figuring out those pathways, and you've had a lot to do with it. So I just wanted to give you an opportunity to speak about it if you wanted to add anything to that.
Yeah, well, I think like one important part of that is when we say the children of the church of today, not just the church of tomorrow, that what we do with the ministry of children's ministry and youth ministry now is really essential because of who they are in this moment, not just who they will be in the future. And so part of, having your son in children's ministry for the last, how old is he, 10, 9?
He's 9.
9 years, is because all of that, during all of that space, he's had the opportunity to understand Jesus and to express his faith in Jesus in age-appropriate ways. And so that's really, really significant. And it's really, really significant for him now as a 9-year-old to continue to find ways to express faith as a 9-year-old. And so we want really effective children's ministry. We want really effective youth ministry, because right now those children are disciples, or at least can be disciples of Jesus, have the opportunity to be, because they can respond to Jesus in faith. So that's a really key part of it. And then we also, yes, want to have a pathway for them to follow. And part of that pathway is having I suppose it's a programmatic pathway, as in, you go from children's ministry into, there's an overlap there with our Fuse, which is kind of like a kids club. We think of it kind of like a junior youth group, but essentially they're kind of the same. But it's Friday night. And so that's there, and there's an overlap there for those who have come through Soul Revival Kids on the other weekend gatherings to also come on a Friday night for usually year 5 and 6, and then fourth term is that slow intake of year 4s. And then from there, the next pathway is to be coming to youth on a Friday night, not the junior youth program, but the youth program proper with high schoolers, and also at their gathering to come along to the gathering itself and not the Soul Revival Kids program. So there are programmatic elements where we're sort of moving them up, and then, as you said, when we get to year 10, our youth group is year 7 to year 10, and so once they've kind of graduate out of youth group, we then again, there's that invitation to continue in community with us and express that through late night on a Saturday night. So after our gathering on a Saturday night, after our dinner, then there's kind of a bit of a shift in tone, I suppose, on the Saturday night, where it kind of shifts into late night proper. And Lewis might be able to speak a bit more about that, because he's more connected with late night than I've been for a number of years. So there's that programmatic movement, but another really key part of that is we've been a relational community all the way through.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. Yeah.
And that's really, really key, because one of the problems that churches have created for themselves is when you have really strong identities as here's kids ministry, here's high school ministry, here's young adult ministry, here's the rest of the church. When you have sharp distinctions between those, that's where people lose. They leave the production line.
It's like a breaking point.
They come off the conveyor belt. We think that if we put a baby into preschool at church, then by the time they're 30, they'll be in the main church, and it's just this used to faithfulness all the way through. But actually, there needs to be relational glue that holds all of that together, and that's where the all age, all stage approach. So even though your son has been at Soul Revival Kids for a part of Saturday night, actually he's involved in Saturday night as a whole, and so he participates in dinner just like the teenager, just like the 30-year-old, just like the 60-year-old. He engages in the relational time just like all the other ages. He engages in Christmas and Easter and week away, and some of them, as I said, we're also at the planning day, just like all the others. So there are all of these other relational aspects, and that's what will keep people moving through sometimes the harsh change in programmatic elements, but actually it's not that harsh because there's a relational thing. So when your son came to Fuse, which is our kids club, on a Friday, he walked in, he was a bit nervous, it's his first time, there's a whole lot of older kids, a couple who he knows, but a whole lot he don't, because they've got a number who come on Friday nights that don't come from Saturday night. Yeah. But then there was some relational connection to Saturday night. There was a couple of other kids, but then there was me and some of the other leaders, and he walks in and goes, "Oh, Tim's here." And so he goes, "Oh, and I know this person, I know this person." So there's the relational connection means that it wasn't just, here's a whole new group of people, you don't know any of them, see you later. It also means that for the next bit of Friday night, so he stays for dinner, and you stuck around last week as a family. Well, you and your son were both here over dinner. And all the teenagers who are going to be here at youth group are already arriving. All the youth leaders are already arriving. He's now part of this overlapping community of interlocking relationships. And so for the next 2 years, he'll be overlapping for an hour and a half, 40 weeks a year for 2 years, whatever that is, how many hours of relationship is potentially has there in that space, so that actually when he stops coming to kids club but starts coming to youth, there's still that hour and a half overlap that he's already knows, he's super familiar with. And there's a whole lot of people who are not different, like they're not new faces. He might not have met them all before, like they might not know his name, he might not know their name, but they're super familiar because they're always around and they're always smiling at him and saying good day and playing handball or whatever it is. And so that relational glue is really, really essential.
Yep, I think that's right. And they're playing a game called Fresher, which I don't know the rules to. I believe that's a created game by someone at our church.
Oh, it's pretty widespread.
It's widespread. Okay,
I've seen that in a lot of churches.
So I was wrong about that.
I don't understand it. It's a game that I've heard explained dozens of times. I still don't get it. I think it's the most complicated game I've ever tried to understand.
Really?
Yeah.
Well, there's a lot of running involved.
Yeah, and that's what it usually descends to is let's just run.
Yeah.
And
which
play
is
tip.
fine.
Yeah.
But he had a reasonably big fall and grazed his knee, and I said, it's a big graze on his knee, and I said, well, it's not the first night of youth ministry unless you've got a injury.
That's right, absolutely.
Just making clear we don't go out to injure people intentionally, but there's always something going on. Would you agree, Lewis, as a youth leader, there's always something going on at youth?
It's inevitable. Not intentional, inevitable.
Yeah, totally. So let's move on. We talked about planning day, kind of talked about the reason that we, for various reasons, things happen in our church and how we filter through ideas. You brought to the table, Tim, an article.
I did.
Titled, Are Churches Growing or Are Christians Just Shifting?
Yes.
Is that based on us talking about what it meant to be, like what church is for?
Yeah, I think similar to the last article I brought, we had a conversation here on the podcast and then an article pops up in my feed. And I'm just like, oh, that's connected.
Thank you, algorithm.
Thank you, algorithm. Thank you, Siri, for always listening to everything I say. So I don't know what it is, but this came up and I thought it was interesting. It actually is potentially the title is a little bit misleading because the article is titled "Are Churches Growing or Are Christians Just Shifting?" Stephen McAlpine is a minister and frequent blogger, lives over in Western Australia, and this was a guest post by a friend of his talking about the church that they have in Perth. And I thought, or the title thought, this is exactly what we've been talking about on the Shock Absorber, is about the movement of churches, and it was particularly the conversation we had, the episode 2 weeks ago in Stu's backyard, where we were talking about wanting to measure kingdom growth, not just membership growth. And we were trying to tease those apart because your church can get bigger because Christians leave other churches and come to yours. And you can kind of go, oh, look, our church is growing.
We're growing, yeah.
And that can be affirming and it can be encouraging. It can be really restful for those, particularly if they've coming from a place where they feel hurt or burn out or a little bit dry spiritually. And sometimes a shift can help them sort of kickstart something spiritually for them. And so we've seen that a number of times. People might have been starting to become irregular at their church because they were finding, whatever reason, and they come to something new and that kind of reshifts something for them, and God can use that opportunity to grow them. So we never want to undermine the great things that can happen when Christians come to a new church, find it refreshing and flourish as a disciple because of that. So that's wonderful, and that is good ministry that is able to be happening. But when we talked about it as a planning day, or when we were planning for the planning day, we wanted to notice that is good, but we also want to be able to somehow acknowledge and measure when people become Christians. And so we were trying to tease out this difference between growing in membership, growing in number of people who are in your church, versus those who are becoming Christians and therefore joining your church. And so this was a bit of a challenging article because he asked the question, are churches actually growing or are Christians just shifting around? Very early on in the second paragraph, he says, actually, it's the second one, Christians are just shifting around. And then he kind of goes on to how we respond to that, which, he doesn't really dig into that question, wondering why it might be or, dealing with it. He just kind of says, as a pastor, how do you deal with the fact that you might be growing through transfer growth rather than through gospel growth? So helpful things in the article. Didn't quite go where I thought it was going to go though. But
okay.
it was a good article. I just wasn't quite what I thought from the title.
Oh, okay. Because it does mention, hang on, is it various reasons that people might be using, hang on, like I need to actually find it.
Reasons why they're moving?
Yeah. Is it reason why?
Says,
5 considerations in a culture of congregational movement. That's what he termed it, sorry. And he says gloating, grieving, guiding, giving thanks, getting help. So you've got the 5 Gs. That's always helpful.
Which again was more about the heart of the minister who is in the growing church. I think it seems to be who he's writing towards.
Yep.
And part of it is autobiographical. And so he's kind of writing, it seems that at this moment, he is in one of these churches that seems to be growing, and he's made this realisation that actually a lot of these people are coming from other churches, and so he's trying to guard against our first one, gloating, that it can fuel your ego that, obviously we're doing church right because people want to come to us. So that's the first one. So all the 5 or 6 Gs, whatever he's got, are all about the heart of the church pastor. So he's largely writing to church pastors, particularly those who are at the growing side of that church equation, not those of the shrinking congregation, though he touches on that as well.
Lewis, you had a quick look at the article. Any thoughts immediately come to mind?
I think it was I've never actually considered the perspective of like people move churches. Like we've had a lot of people move to our church recently, it feels like. In particular, I know quite a few people have come from one church, and the reason that they're moving is because in their own word, it's sort of effectively dying is sort of their way of describing it.
It's
like
tough,
it's
isn't it?
on its way, and they're quite sad about that. And it's like we were talking about, like, it's great that they found a new church where they feel like they're connecting and it's good for the individual, but at the back of your mind, it's like, man, but the church is dying.
Yeah.
And while numbers are good for setting goals and all that stuff, I think like that. The point I think he's trying to make is that it's about the kingdom's numbers, not your church's numbers, which is frankly not a way of looking at it I've considered.
Well, also because you probably, it's the same for me. I've only really been part of one ministry too, whereas, for example, especially if it's a pastor, they see a lot more people come through, I suppose. It could be the same ministry, but and I wonder if it's the way that we've grown up too, you and I, in Soul Revival ministry, and or Tim has as well. I shouldn't discount Tim either, but Tim has a lot more experience in experiencing other ministries. But I do wonder if it's maybe a credit to some degree to our leaders of making sure that we do remain humble and knowing, like we even said at the planning day, like we're partnering with Jesus as he builds his church. It's not us, even though consistently, and I've been trying to articulate this better, but we're consistently tricked into thinking that we're doing it on our own, and that can be in all parts of our lives, but then even as a pastor, for example, it must be even harder knowing that you're a leader. You've been set aside as a shepherd of the flock, so to speak, and then if you're being like, as we have to guard against being tricked into thinking that we're responsible for this, or we have autonomy over this. I think maybe that's one of the things that the writer is trying to ward against, or at least warn people against. Yeah.
I was chatting with Mike Dicker, the principal of YouthWorks College, the other day at lunch. He's still principal, right? He's still principal. Yeah, just making sure. And we were sort of chatting about how it's not the only job, I suppose, like this, but being a minister of any kind, like your whole identity and meaning and your purpose in life is bound up with your work in a sense. and he was sort of making the point where it's like how do you as a Christian respond when your church, you know, the work of your life and your heart fails, or someone says you're doing a crap job or whatever, like. And he was talking about how hard it is to, I suppose, remove your ego from that. That even though you can be aware of like, oh, like my identity is rooted in Christ and it's not about me, but it's about him. Like you still sort of pour your blood, sweat and tears over something, and you do it servant-heartedly and with passion and love, right? Like you care deeply. It's not just work, but yeah, seeing things go wrong and getting harsh feedback is crushing. And it doesn't surprise me that people do sort of fall back onto, I guess, some of these coping mechanisms like gloating and trying to bolster yourself and how you feel about your church, because it can very easily become something you ground your emotions and your worth in. So definitely good to be warning against it, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, it'd be so hard. Like, I mean, every minister or pastor or anyone on staff that I know just works really hard. And then to be like, if you're like, we were talking to someone today that their church plan, they decided to close up their church plan, for example. Like to knowing you're working so hard for something that you truly believe in, you want people to know the gospel, and then have that taken away from you, like it's a very large bruise to your ego.
Yeah. And
I think you need to be careful of that. But it's kind of getting off the point that we're talking about in terms of growth. But Tim, what was after reading it and obviously sharing it with us, what was your enduring takeaway from it? Is in regards to your own, like you're in a variety of leadership positions. What was your own takeaway? Did you have anything you wanted to apply?
Yeah, I think the application he's driving towards, which I find helpful, is, as I said, sort of guarding your heart, particularly when your church is doing well. And I think this is where I resonate with what Lewis just shared, and Dico obviously was sharing, was, what does success look like as a minister of God? And it's easy to tie, I am doing well at being a minister by the number of people at church and how people are growing in their knowledge and love of Jesus, and how people are becoming Christians. And but a lot of that is outside of our control. We obviously input into that. We're prayerful about those things, but God is the one who makes things grow. And so part of this is, I think, as he said, he's writing as on the side of the pastor whose church is growing, just to remember that actually if your church is growing, it's because God is at work. And so you can, don't gloat, but also he talks about grieving for the church that people are leaving from. And so as Lewis said, we've had some people come to our church who are grieving the loss of their church, and for us to mourn with them and to sit with them in lament, to say they have invested a lot into their church and they feel that their church is not in a healthy place at this particular point in time. And so really guarding ourselves against going, well, glad that's not us, glad that we're doing okay, but actually entering into their grief, and not just their grief, but the grief of the ministry team at another church who may be on the shrinking side of this shifting of Christians. How must they be feeling? If they also, if we wrap our identity up with how our church is going, then when it's doing really well, we'll be tempted to pride, and when it's failing, we'll be tempted to despair. And so I think he sort of guards against both of those by trying to set it outside of ourselves and not make the size of our church and part of our identity. But it is really hard. I mean, it isn't just ministry that you form an identity about the job that you do and the work that you do, but it is really significant because it's also tied up to our spiritual identity and who we are in Christ. It's easy to conflate those kinds of things together. So I just found as I said, it didn't quite go where I thought it was going to go, but the instruction that he gives and the encouragement he gives in terms of guarding yourself, guarding your flock as well. He talks about the needing to guide, give thanks, getting help, all of those kinds of things. This is great. We'll put the link in the show notes. But yeah, I did find a really helpful reminder of how to think about church and church ministry.
Lewis, as someone studying the Bible at college, does this article and what came out of it and what Tim's talked about, does that kind of change your perspective on going forward? I mean, you are only, you've been to YouthWorks for 2 years, but you've also only just started college as well. But are you thinking about it differently?
That's like a future in ministry, do you mean?
No, more just like if you have a future in ministry, does this article have an impact of how you've been thinking about it?
Sometimes I think about how limited my church experience is. Soul Revival is my first and only church, and I've only visited really like a few small ones. I mean, the closest thing to a church context outside of my own is going to YouthWorks and to Moore College, and it's not really like it's a Christian community, it's a gathering, but it's not really a church either. And so I sometimes think I'm so used to I don't say this in like a boastful way, but in a sense, like I am sort of used to things going well in church.
Okay.
Like my experience was I joined this church when we first started, and my whole, mind you, I've not been that closely involved with staff and the church itself, and I wasn't a Christian until fairly recently, so this is, maybe I've missed some pivotal moments along the way, but my impression has always been like our church has just always gotten bigger and more people have joined, and things just, in my mind, seem to keep growing and getting better. And like, I don't think, like COVID, I think in my memory, like COVID was the biggest hit we ever took. And that, although it was difficult, it wasn't like the church schismed or something, you know what I mean, or it blew up. But I suppose like that kind of hardship that's being spoken about in this article about potentially losing your church and like a church falling apart. Like he is talking from the perspective of someone who's having people come to him, right? And so the whole point of the article is, well, consider this other church, and like, yeah, it makes me wonder, like, it's one thing to talk about like, yes, when people come to our church and from their broken church and blah, 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 and that's part of the thing he's warning against is probably don't get too used to your context or what's happening, what God is doing in your church. Because one day God might take your church away and you might end up moving to someone else's church. But yeah, my ministry at Soul Revival would always be like, I wonder how many more church plants we'll have 10 years from now and blah, 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 blah. You just shouldn't count on anything because God will do whatever he wants, I guess, for the best. But I feel like I'm rambling at this point, but it's I think it just has made me realize that, yeah, church is not, and again, interacting with other churches, with people moving from our churches and going to college, hearing stories about other ministries and churches and things going wrong, it's like, yeah, okay, like these are things we need to watch out for and protect our church from difficult things, which I've not had to deal with myself yet. So I don't know.
And as well, I mean, where I thought the article was going to go, which is more in line with where we talked about 2 weeks ago, was that church growth through people movement, a Christian movement, is fine. But what we should be deeply striving for is people who are not yet Christians becoming Christians. And so he doesn't really get into that, which is I've found surprising, given the setup. But that's kind of the point that we were trying to make in our planning for the planning day, was we actually want to celebrate when people become Christians, when those who, like Lewis, go from darkness to light. That's the really key thing to be looking at. And that's one of the metrics of a healthy church is not just that Christians find your church more attractive than the church next door that they were at, but people are becoming Christians. The gospel is growing. That mustard seed is becoming the mustard tree. Yeah, all of those kind of imagery that Jesus gives of things that are growing and flourishing, and we should expect that from a healthy church, that people are coming into the light from the darkness because of the ministry of that church. That would be the normal rhythm of things. And so we should expect that. Talking about numbers is always fraught because, again, we can't control that. It's God that is doing the work. And yet it is also significant to notice and to celebrate when Jesus talks the story of the lost sheep. He goes out and finds the lost sheep and brings it back, and the whole village celebrates with Jesus when he brings a lost sheep out of the darkness and back into the light, into the fold again. And so, that's the old attitude we want to be cultivating as well. We want to be looking out on mission. We want to be thinking about those who are not yet Christians. We want to be rejoicing with those who are contemplating Christianity or are coming along because they enjoy the community but are deeply not committed, which is where Lewis was for a long time. And then all of a sudden, God spoke to your spirit at just the right time and became a Christian. That's what we want. We want to see and celebrate those things.
I think but it's in a way it's hard to measure that, isn't it? Which is
hard,
why we have things like articles and discussions about it, because it's like, how do we actually make that happen? And I wonder if it's kind of like just a human thing of like we just need to know, but then it almost goes back to something I was talking about earlier, is that we can't be in control of everything, and we can only partner with God and allow him to do what he's going to do, because we talked about Japanese culture, and we were saying how unique even going to Japan is, like you were saying, Lewis, and that's probably because they have a really strong commitment to holding those particular values that they think are true and really important in their country. But then we also said, like, some of the shadows might be that there are some shadows possibly around Japanese culture, and I don't mean to be demeaning Japanese culture either. I mean, every culture has its own shadows, but holding on to that so hard is also, can be a shadow. And I think it's similar to church, so we can be really strong in our identity in Jesus. That's always there. But we were also talking about strategy in church, is it's a kind of our church's identity, our local church's identity it's really helpful to stick to that. But there also can be shadows of sticking way too hard on that. And then talking about like transfer growth and just focusing on pure metrics are not an ideal way, as this article highlights, not an ideal way of thinking about that. And then pastors can fall into those traps as well, that we get tricked into thinking that that's important. So it's been an interesting discussion. Any other final thoughts before we wrap up, lads? Black shirted people. I really am not very good on this podcast. I don't mean to be rude. We made the point again that like I just wear. You made the point, Lewis. Like, why aren't you wearing a black shirt? Or I think you did, Tim. And then you said, why aren't I wearing more salmon?
We're the majority here. I feel like we should be paying you.
Yeah, that's probably true. Actually, what do you think you were before the podcast? So I'm using the podcast to get back at you.
Keep bringing the salmon, Joel. Keep bringing the salmon.
Is it salmon?
Bring the salmon.
I mean, it's all sorts of colours, isn't it?
Yeah, there is a few different colours.
Yeah,
it's a bit
check it out on YouTube if you want to see
a bit loud, isn't it, Joel?
Well, that's me, isn't it? Just a bit too loud. Just a bit too loud. Lewis, thank you very much for coming on the podcast.
Right. Thank you for having me on, so I can spout misinformation about Japanese history.
And you fact checks.
You fact checked it and corrected it.
Yeah.
So that was good. And Tim, thank you.
All right.
Thank you for the article. Thank you for doing the Bible talk on theology, strategy, practice, and we'll keep talking about that, I think.
Yeah.
It's been really important.
Well, by the time this comes out, I will have preached it all weekend.
I'm looking forward to that. Are you doing it on Saturday night?
Saturday night and Sunday morning.
Excellent. I look
both
forward
at Kirrawee. So
fantastic. Well, we've just lost the camera, but that's okay because we're wrapping up the episode.
We are wrapping up.
But thank you very much.
This is the animated segment.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, maybe. There might be an animated segment. We'll see. Anyway, thank you, boys. Thanks for coming on. Thank you to everyone listening. If you have any questions, you want to continue the conversation, email me, joel@shockabsorber.com.au. And we'd love to hear from you. And if you have any questions, we can answer them on the podcast. I feel like Lewis is going to send one in. Who is that Lewis guy? Don't ever get him on again. But yeah, it's been cool. So we'll finish up with a one way.
One way.
Thank you. Oh,
You have to imagine that.
Lewis
one
didn't
way.
do it. Lewis didn't do the one
I did
way.
a cheeky.
Oh, he did a cheeky one way. All right. Thanks.
They can't even see.